Okay, thank you very much. Olaf has gave me this challenge to talk about lessons from coastal shipping reforms. 2 years back in 2017, I got in touch with a colleague, Dimitris Liridis from Greece, and I asked him if he wanted to take the challenge to review the cabotage policies of different countries to assess how things were. And the simple reason was that there was lack of literature on what was going around the world. And what I'm going to show to you is the outcome of that study that resulted into published papers, which are available. So, but before we go on, I will start with some issues that we've been talking yesterday, which is an issue of definitions. And as I said, we consider the short sea shipping market to include 3 different segments. The first one is the feeder services derived from deep sea trades. The second one is the inter-European trade services. And the third one is the cabotage services. Of course, they will cover the different market segments like ro-ro shipping, container shipping, sea river, special services like project cargoes, containerized services, dry and mail-bulk cargoes, and liquid cargoes. And given that we are talking about integration of short sea shipping in transport chains as part of logistics and supply chain management, we need to think about it as multimodal, intermodal, synchromodality, and comodality as well, door-to-door basis, containers and trailers, floating stock as an alternative to road transport, and the role that information technology has in all this process, because sometimes it's not the physical process that hampers the movement of goods, but the information one. So we have gone from a port single window to a national single window. The European single window is being considered, and in our case in Portugal, we already have the logistics single windows in place, meaning that all players along the logistics chain can participate. And if you are talking about ships, containers, full containers, empty containers, trailers, a number of inventory that we need to consider to make the movement of cargoes from origin to destination, then you need to have all this management of resources. In what concerns cabotage, there is no word worldwide to define it. Or what concerns coastal shipping, there is no one word to define it, because if you go along the world and if you pick up the different legislative documents issued by the different countries, we can find the terms maritime cabotage, coastal navigation, domestic shipping, coastal shipping and trading, coasting shipping trade, and coastwise, depending upon the geographical area of the world. And in all this, we can also see that there is no origin from the word cabotage. I usually prefer to talk about maritime cabotage than coastal shipping, because in the Portuguese law, and I know this is a very particular situation, we have national cabotage and then we have international cabotage. So meaning that the vessels can register in different areas. So I prefer the word cabotage because it really means trade along the national coast. So what we have to say is that the concept of coastal shipping dates back from the 15th century, at the time of the discoveries, and it usually became a legal source of conflict among countries. And some say that the French promulgated the first legal principle of cabotage in the 16th century. And the word cabotage some also say that comes from the French word cabotage. And but the most important issue is that there are 2 English laws that were released during Cromwell's, which are the Navigation Act of 1951 prohibiting foreign vessels from engaging in coastal trade in England, and required that all goods imported from the continent of Europe to be carried on either English vessels or vessels registered in the country of origin of goods, and which was then extended by the Staple Act of 1663, saying that all colonial exports to Europe be landed through an English port before being exported to Europe. Some economists say that these are the principles behind the establishment of the Jones Act in 1920, because if you look at the legislation in place, these are really the principles behind them. So the concept of cabotage, as we knew after the discoveries, and in fact, the issue of cabotage was a measure that countries like England and France developed to fight the dominance of the Dutch dominance of the waters over those times. So it's a historical issue. Changed completely after the World War II, when the colonies became independent, and the concept of cabotage, which until that time included also the trade between the country, England and its colonies, or Portugal and its colonies, became far more restricted and became more important, because while some countries have developed had a vision and developed their shipping policy taking into account world markets. For instance, in our case in Portugal, we were much focused, our fleet, which was already one of the biggest in the world, was much focused on the trades between Portugal and the colonies. Which happens that we had the revolution, we suffered the crisis, and then because of our lack of entrepreneurial attitude, we suddenly lost a market, had an old fleet in hands with no capacity to be put into the international market, and also without the knowledge of the distribution channels, how you're going to use that fleet into the world market. And then that became a reason even for us to lose the significant role that we had back in the industry in terms of moving goods by sea. So today, what we consider as cabotage includes services among ports located along the country's coastline, island cabotage services, and offshore supply services. At the European Union, and I must say that this data concerns 2009, it sometimes is very difficult to find updated information on these markets, is that cabotage represents a small part of the broad EU shore sea shipping, almost 20% in what concerns goods, and 45% in what concerns passengers. Some studies have been carried out on cabotage, and what the study that made us go through this whole process was this study that was carried out by Marat back in 1991, which covered 56 countries, and they used a survey to find out about the existing or not legislation that govern cabotage in the countries that they addressed. They also considered fleet subsidies, crewing requirements, ownership restrictions, domestic construction provisions, and reflagging conditions. At the same time that we were starting our study, we came to find out at a later stage that the UNCTAD have promoted a study also on cabotage, and the ITF in 2018 another study, and then we had our study published in Maritime Business Review. This is the first part of the study. So how did we approach this aspect? We had to first identify the different geographic areas of the world. Then we had to identify sources of information, because I am Portuguese, and I can understand a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of Portuñol, as we say. I could dig into the Spanish legislation, particularly in Latin America. As a rule, there is a lot of research being conducted on Australia, the Jones Act, Europe, but when it comes to Africa countries or Latin America countries, except with Brazil, where there is considerable research on the cabotage services. The rest of the world, there's there was a gap in the literature. So we decided to split the world in these 7 geographical areas and carry out and investigate all these issues. So as a result, we at the time, and we consider the European Economic Area, and still we have the UK in it because the UK was still part of the EU. And we also included Iceland and Norway because of the agreements they had and because they also had incorporated in their legislation the Regulation 3577 of 1992 addressing maritime cabotage at EU level. So it didn't make sense for us to leave those 2 countries out. Then we consider Africa, the former Soviet Union and Middle East, Asia, Oceania, North America, and Latin American. And overall, we covered 78 countries. So we're going through the legislative acts of these countries. Was a tough work. Of course, some of them we were discovering as we go into the literature review. This was not a straightforward process. So as we move from one country to another, as we identified legislation in another country, we would add to our list. Out of the analysis, it is worth addressing the situation at European level, particularly because we are now regulated by this regulation from 1992, in which the European Commission had to find a way to sort out a bottleneck that was preventing the establishment of the I'm missing the word, of the internal market. And because there were disagreements between the North and the South European countries, and this was open for discussion. And so what happened is that with this regulation, the European Commission ended up establishing a 2-level playing field, in the one in which member states were granted the access to the cabotage markets of the other member states, but also leaving the member states to decide whether they allow it non-member states, no EEA member states to participate in their cabotage market. So, for instance, if a Panamanian vessel wants to go into the Italy market, it has to be subject to the rules of the Italian government, and it will decide if that vessel can go in or not. In this way, we could reach a consensus. But if I look from the perspective of this table, I cannot say that the market is fully liberalized, because even when I take into account the second registers that exist at the EU level, things are not so straightforward, because from a legislation in force, the Spanish Canary Islands, Portuguese Madeira, and Gibraltar second registries can have unrestricted access to cabotage. Cargo vessels registered in Danish International Shipping Register have access to cabotage, while passenger vessels do not. Vessels registered in German International Register and in the Finnish list of cargo vessels in foreign traffic have no access to regular cabotage, but only on a case-by-case basis. Vessels under the Italian second register are allowed on a case-by-case basis up to 6 cabotage journeys per month, or up to unlimited cabotage journeys if these are over 100 nautical miles. So, I mean, the legislation in force has created a number of constraints, which also, if you take into account Article 4 of the regulation, we we have paved the way to create further bottlenecks, because it allows countries at a national level to define the conditions under which member states have to operate. For instance, if you go to the islands of Azores and Madeira, you need to provide the concept of, you need to provide a public service, meaning that you have to have a number of calls per week to the islands. The crew must be of Portuguese, and so I mean all these things are constrained. So the market is liberalized, but subject to certain constraints. So if you go addressing the issues that we found out, we can address it from the regional perspective and also from a country's perspective. But the thing is that even if you try to address it from a regional perspective, we end up having to look at a country's perspective. From a regional perspective, the analysis suggests that the countries belonging to the same region in the world, as in the case of North and Latin America, tend to adopt very similar cabotage services, regimes, sorry. And Ricardo Sanchez was already addressing that yesterday. We could consider that economic development of these countries could have an influence on these decisions. But the fact is that if you consider the Jones Act, it doesn't make sense that the United States has such a legislation when lives in the principles of liberalized economy. Out of the 7 regional areas that we have addressed, without doubt, and even despite the constraints that the regulation of 1992 issued by the Commission, we are still the most advanced system in what concerns cabotage policies. And the political changes that have taken place in some African countries, particularly after the Second World War and as they were given independence, we would be expected that they would be more active in terms of cabotage, but in fact they haven't, despite the African Maritime Transport Charter under Article 11 stating that these countries should promote protectionist cabotage regimes to protect trade. Now, other findings that from a regional level, the Asian cabotage also presents a wide range of established cabotage policies. If we look at the Japanese cabotage regime, is still fully protected, and it has been like that for many, many years. However, others have evolved to accommodate market changes, as is the case of India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and China. Malaysia, Indonesia, and China are very interesting regimes because both Malaysia and Indonesia cabotage regimes, they were liberalized. And a couple of years ago, they decided to close the cabotage to foreign vessels, but with the principle that the main reason that they would want a shipping industry to prosper. And in fact, it happened because there was a boom in the national shipping companies and trade, and the number of shipyards increased. So the measure had a very positive effect on their domestic policy. The issue of Malaysia has nevertheless changed because the higher cost of transshipment of containers has forced them to open certain trades along the coast. So what we are seeing, and the same as well in Indonesia, what we are seeing is that despite they have adopted protected cabotage regimes, as the market changed, they tended to adopt their policies to meet the shippers' needs, so that they could not increase the cost of maritime transport. In the case of China, the market has been protected. However, they have released certain trades, particularly in the container market, because of the cost of repositioning the empty containers. So we have certain trade. Not all trades are open. Only a reduced number of trades have been open because of that. The analysis also suggests that from a regional perspective, North and Latin Americas adopt very similar protected cabotage regimes. And one of the issues that may change this situation is the agreement between Canada and the EU, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement signed a couple of years ago, in which at the time of the signing, there were some concerns that from the Canadian shipping industries, for fear that our shipping companies, European shipping companies, could invade their market and destroy their conditions. In Oceania, cabotage has been dominated by Australia. Cabotage, you can find a number of papers on Australia cabotage. They have already had a permit policy. Now they have been having a license one. I must say that since the time we finished writing the paper, I have not checked the evolution of their policy. But the thing is that the subject was being discussed at the Parliament, because one of the issues that Australian shipping has to deal with is the higher cost of their workforce. So it is a matter for them to find out the best option so that their shipping industry can prosper. Despite this, New Zealand appears to have solved out the problems. They have liberalized. They have their own cabotage environment as well, in which the national shipping companies participate, but they allow the transport of containers, and again, this reflects the container market, the containers to be carried out by foreign vessels. From a country perspective, the analysis shows that most countries tend to adopt protectionist cabotage policies, and that is a clear issue, and they can do it either cargo reservation schemes or through implementation of specific cabotage legislation, or under countries' commercial trade codes, or within the scope of laws that govern their maritime transport activity. And the analysis also indicates that different countries have implemented their cabotage regimes in different ways. A reduced number of countries, such as Japan, United States, and Peru, have adopted strict cabotage policies. I know that Ricardo has highlighted that the law has been changed. And I was checking yesterday. They allow foreign flagged vessels, except for the transportation of hydrocarbons, which is a similar situation to Ecuador, in which the transportation of hydrocarbons is still under the control of national vessels. In one of the most discussed also policies from a coastwise perspective is the one of Nigeria, which was released in 2003, although due to local interests, the implementation of this act has been taking some years to be in place. It appears from what I've read yesterday that they're trying at this moment to get it in force in order to promote the national shipping industry. Again, Malaysia and Indonesia, as we have talked about, at a timing point have adopted strict cabotage policies, but after that they have been liberalizing policies for a number of years. One market, as I told you, is the is the container shipping market. The other one is the cruise industry, cruise one. So so you can see that control also protectionist cabotage policies have been the wide scope of a number of countries such as South Korea, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Taiwan, Canada, and Mexico, among many other countries. Although because they allow the participation of foreign vessels in their cabotage trades whenever necessary. It is also clear that as you go around the world and as you read through their national legislations, we can find some points of commonality, like the nationality of the shipping company, the ownership structure of the shipping company, the limitation to foreign investment, the flag under which the vessels operating in cabotage are registered, the percentage of nationals within the crew that man the vessels, the necessity or not to apply for a license, the possibility to charter in foreign flag vessels if no national vessels are available, and the principle of reciprocity, the application of this principle. In terms of percentage of nationals, they can vary between 60, 70, 75%. It depends on the countries, as well as the ownership structure. They can say that a shipping company can have 51% of nationals and the remaining percentage of the capital be foreign. Others determine that it is 60%. Others say that it is 80%. It depends on the interests of the country. So, I mean, independently of the legislation, what we can see is that there will be a limitation to foreign investment. Okay. Australia, we consider that it falls within the scope of control liberalized cabotage policies because of its unique license system. And finally, we can find numerous countries in which have chosen for liberalized cabotage regimes, which is the UK, South Africa, Namibia, United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon. So what we came to, we tried to classify the different cabotage policies according to their restrictions, and then we find these 5 types. So from fully protected cabotage policies to fully liberalized cabotage policies. And then we've got this table. I have highlighted Mexico and Peru because I've made some changes. And one of the issues that I don't know here because I didn't have the time is to know if Mexico needs a license, or how the conditions to foreign vessels are made. But certainly this is some issues that we can cover we can review to update this table. Now, one of the issues so we have 2 countries here with fully protected. Japan, we don't hear so much. The United States, we hear quite a lot for some the worst reasons, like the cabotage, like the congestion that took place in the ports of West Coast and is still there also in some ports of the East Coast. Sorry. During the pandemic. Also because of the problems that it can raise when there are hurricanes, and we've seen the Hurricane Fiona that can raise disturbances in the supply, and also when it was the Colonial Pipeline ransomware in May 2021, which affected the distribution of jet fuel and gasoline byproducts from crude oil. So in doing all this process, we came out and we find out a list of reasons that covered not only the protectionist cabotage policy and also the liberalized cabotage policies. We know that there are a number of reasons which governments try to find out to justify the adoption of cabotage of their policies, but also we also identified the policy instruments that they have been using, and in order to assess the validity of these reasons and instruments, we did a survey. And the survey was sent to consultants and researchers in this area, and which can be biased because one of the comments from the paper reviewers was saying, why don't you send it to the governments, to the industry? And the simple reason is that some countries find this addressing cabotage as a very sensitive issue, and we could not have a proper insight into the survey because no one wants to answer these questions. So what you can, so that's why the reason we decided for researchers and that have been working on this area and some consultants. And what you can find is that there are no very important reasons, for instance, that lead countries to adopt a cabotage policy. We use a 7-point Likert scale, and the reasons are somewhat important and neither important nor important. The ones in blue are neither important nor important, and the ones in purple are somewhat important. So there is no extraordinary reasons leading to the adoption of protectionist cabotage policies. And when we look at the instruments for implementing them, we can see that only one is considered somewhat unimportant, which is full public ownership of cabotage shipping companies. I mean, there is nothing extraordinary. Sometimes it leads me to think that we are somehow copying policies from one country to another and try to implement in our own home. So if I go into the liberalized cabotage policy, again, I have two fairly important reasons to promote the development of maritime logistics and to lower the overall cost of cabotage operations. But again, the remaining ones are somewhat important and neither unimportant nor important. So they are neutral, which is not understandable why so much focus has been given to all these issues without having a proper policy implemented. And when it comes to the instruments, it is somehow similar. Now, what we did, because we had all this information, we tried to aggregate it, and we carried out a factor analysis. And so for the protectionist markets, the reasons are mainly socioeconomic reasons, market and operational reasons, commercial reasons, and legal reasons. In terms of instruments being used in the protectionist market, we think about financial policy instruments, ship acquisition policy instruments, market structure, and reservation policies. For liberalized markets, we consider that the reasons behind adopting a liberalized cabotage policy are market reasons, economic reasons, operational reasons, and internationalization of activities reasons. And as for instruments, we're talking about market and regulatory policy instruments, port policy instruments, legal policy, and economic policy instruments. I must say that we initially have classified these reasons and policy instruments addressed before under another classification. But when doing the factor analysis at the request of the reviewers, we could see that our initial classification was not right, and this one would make much sense. Now we have some implications of all this. One issue that raises concerns, as part of this whole process, is that when dealing with cabotage trades and even short sea shipping trades, we are talking about sin trades. And so if you have sin trade, we have imbalanced trades, and we have some trades in which we are importing more than exporting. And this adds costs, because if we are considering the container shipping, we are saying that moving a container shipping container, a full container, costs as much as an empty container. So there is a price to be paid. When we dealing with the trade to the islands, as is the case of Portugal to the Azores and Madeira, we end up with a fleet overcapacity. And I sent all of the papers that are behind these studies, is that a couple of years ago, we carried out a study to optimize the operations to the Azores and Madeira based on the amount of TEUs being handled. And at the time, there were 6 companies. And we found out that we could do the same job after the vessels. So, I mean, this is a matter to think about, because at the end of the day, we have an overcapacity of fleet overcapacity, in which the islands are paying a higher price, and in which we are using a trade sometimes to justify the financial viability of shipping companies. And we are living in a liberalized market. And still, it is my belief that is a hidden collusion, even though that is not possible not possible from a legal perspective, given the laws and principles of the European Union. But the thing is that I cannot understand why there are still nowadays 4 shipping companies doing the same trade. And the thing is that we don't see, in our case, there is no exponential increase in trade volumes. So the vessels go, we're talking about ships with 400 TEUs, but if you have 6 ships with 400 TEUs supplying the islands to the Azores and Madeira, that's a lot. I mean, and the thing is that from Madeira, we have bananas, milk, and from Azores, we have milk and pineapples. So the only solution would be to reindustrialize the regions, but that will take some time. But the fact is that as we have this principle of public service, we are paying a price at the national level. So what we also can get from the cabotage policies is that flexible operations are missing. Freight rates are higher than expected. Reposition of empty containers is an issue. When we talk to the Portuguese ship owners about triangulation of empty containers, like for instance, because some cargo comes from North Europe, it goes to Portugal, from Portugal it goes to the Azores, and it would make sense for a vessel to go to one of the islands to pick up the empty containers to reposition them in the north of Europe. They don't want to hear about. So they want the empty containers to come back to Lisbon so that they can fill in. Sorry, so that they can fill in their vessels, and then to reposition at the origin, and that is a cost. And if you are talking about decarbonizing the shipping industry, you need to reduce the footprint of the containers being moved. Port congestion is an issue, and I'm sure that if The United States had scrapped their Jones Act. My dreams, yes. I don't think they will ever do it. But I believe that if they had scrapped for the Jones Act a couple of years ago, they would not have suffered the congestion levels that we have witnessed in January this year. The thing is that by January, I was looking at the port planning, and I could not believe that they only had 26 ports on the West Coast. The number of ports they have for that size of country is very limited, and only 3-4 of them on the West Coast are prepared to receive the mega carriers. So, I mean, if they had scrapped the Jones Act, probably the cargo could have been discharged at Canada and Mexico, in other ports, and then with the cabotage service in operation, they could move the containers to other gateways, because they have a number of small ports along the coast capable of receiving smaller ships. But the thing is that, I hope they will think about it, but the number of waivers that they give over the years has been so limited. We can count by the fingers of our hands. So I don't believe that they will change it. There's also the issue of fleet renewal. I mean, if you don't open the services, you cannot be competitive. And so vessels tend to be older than they should be. Now that you are thinking about the decarbonizing industry, it is a problem. In fact, in terms of our trade to the islands, the vessels are not that old, but in other areas of the globe, it can be an issue. And also, one of the main points also I want to say is that it lacks, whenever you've got entrepreneur cabotage policy, protectionist cabotage policies in place, it lacks the entrepreneurial attitude, because shipping companies tend to focus on one trade and live on that trade alone, and it prevents them from going into new markets, adopt new business practices, and eventually the collusion, an invisible collusion behind it. And that's it. And the studies behind, the studies behind this presentation are here. I sent them to Olaf for you to have access to them, and thank you very much.